there's always been this posturing of like people who are anti-war, which is a really meaningless proclamation because no one is really anti-war and no one is pro-war. It depends on which war. Some you're anti, some you're pro, depending on the standards. You both can comment on this, but Elan, in Winning the Unwinnable War, you famously in this chapters talk about, when I was reading it, being anti the Iraq war, but being pro Iran being identified as the threat post 9/11. So how does Iran meet the standard of intervention, military intervention, in a way that Iraq didn't? Because I do think the isolationists are making an interesting case where they're saying it's flawed, but they're saying because these previous military entanglements and engagements were wrong, so is Iran, without actually applying without actually applying any nuance to the situation or distinction.
I can understand people's reactions to Iraq and Afghanistan and their view. The more charitable view of this is, look at what happened in Iraq, look what happened in Afghanistan. Who could possibly want to replay that movie? It was a horror movie. It was a fiasco, and maybe that's even being too kind to what happened. My reaction is, you have to understand why those were fiascos and what was the right response after 9/11. And this is something the our institute has been really vocal about. And weeks after 9/11, actually days after 9/11, we published a full-page ad in the New York Times and the Washington Post arguing that the target and what should have been the target after 9/11 and before was Iran and not other of these targets. So I would break this down as follows. The reason to think Iran as the primary threat is to understand Iran as the wellspring, the source, the financial and spiritual source of the Islamist movement. So when people think of 9/11, they think al-Qaeda. That is not wrong. Al-Qaeda is part of the Islamist movement. But it should be understood that the Islamist movement is a kind of umbrella term that includes al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic State, and principally the Iranian regime. And I would put Saudi Arabia in here too, but it's a different kind of case. Mm-hmm. So the Islamist movement is predicated on the idea of enforcing Islamic religious law as a total system wherever they can exert their power. And we saw that under Islamic State. We saw that in Afghanistan under the Taliban. We see it in Iran since 1979. So the history of America and Iran started this. They after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, they took the U.S. embassy. That's an act of war. They took American diplomats hostage. Again, act of war. And America's response to that was far, far from adequate. And Ayn Rand actually famously said, if we didn't go to march on them days after this aggression, we would take us years to live this down. And she was right. We haven't lived it down. And Iran just became a worse threat because our responses to them were appeasing and accommodating. And that is a moral failure for decades. Then 9/11 comes along. And what is 9/11 if not the reverberations of the Iranian Revolution that brings Islamic totalitarianism to power in one country and ignites a worldwide movement in the belief that, look, they managed to take over Iran. There is no limit to what we can do. They punched the United States in the face. They gave a black eye to the world's most powerful regime. There is no limit to what we can do. And you see Islamists, not all of them Shi'a, not all of them in Iran, everywhere in Senegal, in the Middle East, all over the world thinking, all right, the dawn has come. It's time for jihad. And this supercharges a movement that was prior to that not really a salient factor in the sense of believing they could accomplish anything. Hamas, for example, originated from an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. And their strategy was, it was a generational cultural revolution. And eventually we'll do jihad when everything's ready. And then what did they realize in the 1980s? Look at Iran. We're ready now. Let's spin off Hamas. We're ready to go to war. And so what happens after 9/11 is that whole intellectual aspect of the problem, like the nature of the enemy is being driven by these ideas, that is ignored and evaded and dropped out of the picture. And all we get is, we have to go after the Taliban because they hosted al-Qaeda. That is true. I certainly think that was right. But that misses the essence of the problem, which is you have a regime that is chanting death to America, painting that on missiles, marching in the street and telling the world, we're going to kill them over and over and over and over. And what do you do about that? You make friends with them. That is what led to 9/11. That paved the road to 9/11. And that was a bipartisan failure. And then after 9/11, it just got worse and worse because the response was, we're not going after the actual source of the problem. We're going after Iraq, which has no direct relationship either to 9/11 or to the Islamist movement. Saddam Hussein was a basically secular dictator who used religion as a cover for justifying a lot of his evils. And we go after the Taliban, which we let them slip through our fingers because we were just not really serious about going after the threat. So to me, I can understand why people think, yeah, we don't want another Iraq. We don't want another Afghanistan. But you have to understand why those were policy failures, not military failures. Mm-hmm. They're not discrediting of military force. They're discrediting of irrational ideas that we held, and cowardice, moral cowardice, which I think was at the essence of America's foreign policy after 9/11. We do not want to talk about Islam as the source of this problem. You think about what George W. Bush said. Islam is a religion of peace. It's been hijacked by bad people. That is not true. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean every Muslim is a threat, but it certainly means that there's a religious core to Islamic totalitarianism. And we didn't want to talk about it.
And because this was ideologically driven and inspiring the connection of the culprit of 9/11 and Iran being implicated in that, is that this movement was inspired and spread by them across this part of the world to see America as weak and therefore attackable. And that's the connection?
Yeah, for sure. There's actual aggression. So I mentioned the attack on the U.S. embassy, but that didn't stop at taking hostages. And fortunately, they weren't harmed in sort of physical sense. They were psychologically tortured. Then what you have through the 1980s is Iranian proxies, principally Hezbollah in Lebanon, not only taking Americans hostage, but then exploding car bombs, suicide bombs at the American embassy, and then blowing up U.S. barracks with 244 Americans and several, I think a dozen or so French troops. Now, if those are not acts of war, I don't know what is. And that was what happened after that. Yeah. I think Reagan said, "Oh yeah, we'll go after you," and then they evacuate from Lebanon. It's essentially repeating the same lesson of not standing up for America's interests, so not defending Americans and retaliating against that aggression repeatedly. And who takes the lesson there? So the lesson of Lebanon, where America retreated after the bombing of the barracks and the embassy, that is something Osama bin Laden looked at. And he wrote about this. You can read it in Osama bin Laden's letters, in his declaration. Well, yeah, look what those idiots did in Lebanon. Their soldiers are weak. And that was inspiring to someone like him. And so there's direct connections between actual Iranian aggression. So they've been at war with us for decades and we haven't admitted it. That's the way to think of it. And then by the fact that we didn't retaliate, it only encouraged the Islamist movement even more.